So the saga is continuing with respect to a US-Ukraine minerals deal. So what is the latest state of the negotiations, and what does this tell us about the US's direction with respect to supporting Ukraine in its attempts to resist Russian aggression? Let's get into it. Привit and welcome to Geopolitics with Connor Klein. I've been living in Ukraine for many years. Better known for my lifestyle channel, but I actually have a background in international relations, speak Ukrainian and Russian, and was actually former lawyer as well for the European institutions in Brussels. So let's have a look. I'm going to cast my discerning legal eye over what is reportedly in the latest draft of this minerals agreement. You may remember that before the Oval Office debacle between Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, and Volodymyr Zelensky, ostensibly they were there actually to sign a minerals deal. Now I reviewed that on my channel here, the actual final draft that was supposed to be signed. Now I don't think they were actually meeting in order to sign the agreement, and that's one of the reasons why it suddenly wasn't signed. In that it was pretty innocuous. It's basically an agreement to, at some point, agree a real agreement, and there wasn't really that much in it that was concrete. However, prior to that draft becoming official and been published, there had been another draft which didn't resemble the final draft. It basically demanded Ukraine's minerals resources in exchange for absolutely really nothing, claiming that the US was owed all this money. That's why you heard in part probably Donald Trump talking about this fictitious $350 billion that apparently Biden sent to Ukraine. If only he had sent that, Ukraine would be in a lot better position on the battlefield if that had actually been the value of the military equipment that was sent. However, looking at the latest draft, it resembles that original draft that basically was rejected out of hand by Volodymyr Zelensky. He was basically presented with a neo-colonial diktat by the US Treasury Secretary, and he said no. Looks like it's in a different form, but it's pretty close to. Let me read you some of the terms so you can decide for yourself what you think of this kind of structure. So basically there will be a management of 5 people, 3 of them from the USA, who will have full veto power. So they will basically control this new, I guess, minerals extraction vehicle. They're talking about all fossils, so oil and gas, both new and existing. The agreement they were supposed to sign was just going to be new extraction in the future, all over the territory of Ukraine, about mining, state and private campaigns is what's probably badly translated here. Money is immediately converted to currency. Fund money is withdrawn abroad. And the US contribution is basically the assistance from 2022, exactly what I mentioned, that basically Ukraine would get nothing. That's not a quid pro quo. The US provided that assistance, both financial and military assistance. It's also not $350 billion. It's dramatically lower than that. Probably somewhere, the highest realistic, credible estimate I've seen is like 170 billion, and in reality, that was what was appropriate, not what was sent. So much of the money was actually spent in the US restocking US supplies of material, and then they were sending the old stuff to the Ukrainians. So, how much does that really cost the US? It's probably not even 100 billion. It's probably dramatically lower. Anyways, that military aid was worth a lot to the Ukrainians at the same time, even if the dollar value mightn't be as high for the US, because they're obviously getting rid of their almost obsolete stuff that they would have had to pay to have destroyed at some stage. So then there's some other terms. The changes can only be made with the permission of the United States, first night rights on all new infrastructure projects, and veto rights on the sale of resources to other countries. And they can make a profit according to their decision. They receive a royalty from the fund first. It says 4%, and then only after that is Ukraine going to be paid. And of course, there is nothing about security guarantees. Now, what Ukraine wants and why Zelensky is so pedantic about security guarantees goes back to the Budapest Memorandum, 1994. Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. They actually gave them to Russia. Now, there's a lot of debate about whether they could control them, but basically they had the weapons. And they disarmed voluntarily with a promise that was codified in the Budapest Memorandum, where the United States and Russia, UK signed this, and they said that basically Ukraine's territorial sovereignty would be protected and respected, and they also couldn't put it in more normal parlance, like bully Ukraine by using economic or military pressure on them to try and force them to do something. That's actually also in the Budapest Memorandum. So arguably, something like this looks like it's also a violation of the Budapest Memorandum by the United States, prima facie, right? So there, what were described as security assurances. And what did they amount to? Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, illegally annexed Crimea, invaded the Donbass region, and de facto took control of some of those regions. They illegally then annexed part of Ukraine into Russia. So that's not valid under international law and clearly violates the Budapest Memorandum. So what did the US do in response? Well, they put some sanctions on Russia, but they did not do much more than that. So a security assurance really doesn't amount to too much. So what Ukraine is looking for is a security guarantee. So something that will state very explicitly if Russia were to attack new parts of Ukraine after maybe a ceasefire, that the US will respond with military force to achieve X, Y, Z, right? And that would be very clear. It would be a very strong deterrent, because obviously at the moment, Ukraine is not in NATO. They were never close to joining NATO, even though there was some language, some flowery language to encourage them that maybe one day in the future they would join. But the reality is that we're not going to join anytime soon. And at the moment, it also looks like there are too many countries that would be against them joining who are part of NATO, never mind the fact Russia's obviously against it. So what Ukraine wants is something that will replace the fact that they don't have nuclear weapons, which would be presumably an effective deterrence against Russian aggression. And they may actually be encouraged if they don't get US security guarantees and they don't get security guarantees from European partners that are effective deterrents, or that their army, own conventional army, is not going to be strong enough to be an effective deterrence. They may actually basically have to go and look at getting back their nuclear weapons or creating their new ones. And so will many countries in the region, maybe Poland as well. So what they want is a security guarantee. And what Donald Trump has said in the past few weeks is that, if we have investments there into mining, then that is like a security guarantee because we'll protect our workers. In reality, there's a bit of mining going on in some stage in the future that involves US workers on the ground. I'm not really sure there's going to be that many of them. First of all, maybe the management is more likely to be American. And while there were American businesses anyways in Ukraine back in 2022 when Russia did the extended invasion, back in 2014, and now. And Donald Trump is not interested, because he is the current US president, of intervening militarily or doing very much for Ukraine. He doesn't, at the moment, want to even appropriate more funds for continuing the funding after the current Biden administration era funding runs out for Ukraine. Once that's, and he's already cut off, obviously, Intel and some other things for a short period of time, which coincided with the Russian advance in the Kursk Oblast. So his rationale, which I've also heard from people who are MAGA supporters, it doesn't make any sense. I mean, US is not going to send in troops to rescue Ukraine because there are a few US workers there. They'll probably fly them out, those guys. That might be the most they would do, but they're not going to intervene militarily. There's no reason to believe that. They didn't do that in 2014, they didn't do it in 2022, and they're not doing it now. So why would they do it? Just because there were some mines there and a few American workers. So, and it is very telling that Donald Trump argues that that would be in lieu of a security guarantee. If the US was actually going to intervene, they would just provide a security guarantee. Because that would be better to have that deterrence up front, because with that deterrence up front, then Russia is way less likely to invade, because then they'd have to count. Well, the US did give a written security guarantee that if we invade further, then they will respond militarily and kick us out. So we don't really want to test that if possible. As opposed to, well, there's a few American workers there, maybe we could drive around the mines or offer America, I'm talking from Russia's point of view, offer America some incentive to compensate them while we steal the mines and head back towards Kyiv or somewhere else in Ukraine. So yeah, if US was serious about actually intervening in that scenario, they would just give a security guarantee. The reason they don't is because, well, logic you have to conclude they're not going to intervene militarily, and definitely Donald Trump seems even less likely than Joe Biden, and Joe Biden also made it clear he had no intention of putting US boots on the ground, in any case, to protect American workers, protect Ukraine. So what we're looking at is basically some sort of neo-colonial diktat again, similar to what we had prior to when they actually negotiated an agreement to have an agreement about mineral extraction in the future in Ukraine, cooperation between the US and Ukraine on that then was never signed. And now we're back to this again, where basically the US is negotiating, I'm not sure what incentives they're giving behind the scenes for Ukraine to sign this. They have cut off the intel temporarily paused the shipments of the Biden era appropriations for military aid to Ukraine, also some other issues with the F-16 supplying to them. So is that being used behind the scenes, or just the fact they've done that, is that supposed to put more pressure on Ukraine? But this reads just basically like US is not going to give anything, and they just want all these minerals out of Ukraine, and basically to see them as some sort of colony, resource extraction colony, which presumably is what Russia would also, to a certain extent, do if they occupied Ukraine as well. They would presumably tear out of the ground as many resources as possible, like what Russia does within its own country. The Moscow Empire, they basically pull lots of stuff out of the ground in remote regions there, and then the money in general gets funneled back to Moscow, and maybe you could say St. Petersburg as well, the two big cities, and that is what happens. So from my point of view, this is clearly something that Ukraine is not going to sign, that kind of deal. Apparently, Zelensky doesn't even have the authority himself to sign it, and it'd be effective to have to go through the Ukrainian parliament. That is not going to happen. So it's not like the US really believes that Ukraine is going to sign this. So maybe you could say, oh, it's an extreme negotiating position. How it just, these kind of things been leaked out doesn't help the US in general. It just looks extremely exploitive and very imperial in its mindset to Ukraine. And on top of it, one possibility is that the US knows that Ukraine will reject this, and they will then try to frame as, oh, Ukraine didn't want to strike a deal with us on minerals. And yeah, Ukraine, there's no ceasefire, and Ukraine's to blame, even though Ukraine has in principle agreed to a full ceasefire, just that Russia doesn't agree to that. They just want to pick and choose a few parts like the Black Sea, where, well, Russia is in a very weak position at the moment, and then say, yeah, we'll have a cessation of hostilities in the Black Sea, which will basically favor Russia, but on top of it, at the moment, Russia wants the sanctions lifted, many of the sanctions lifted against its banks by not just the US, but by Europe. So again, I'm seeing this probably not as really a negotiation tactic. I'm seeing it more as maybe framing the failure to get a ceasefire, to get any sort of agreement. I mean, the real reason we're discussing this at this point is like for the US to say that they have gotten something politically out of Ukraine as some sort of deal for the future, but it doesn't actually really make any sense in terms of a peace process or winning the war to be even discussing these things. It's a big distraction. So to me, it seems more about framing why everything will fail, and that Ukraine will probably, once that becomes clearer, be blamed by the current Trump administration. That's a very strong possibility looking at the preponderance of evidence at the moment. So write me down below what you think. Is this a fair deal? Is this just a negotiation tactic by the Trump administration? It's been at the bazaar, where they say the price is 3 times more, and then you've got to go a third of what you would give and barter like this, which is not the normal way between allies to really do business. Or is it a little bit more sinister from Ukraine's perspective, that in fact is just something that's not going to fly, never going to be signed in all likelihood, and is really just a way of framing a potential failure to get a peace deal? Remember, Donald Trump did promise during the campaign that he would solve everything in a day, and now it's suddenly become 100 days, and we're soon going to probably hit those 100 days, and then what is going to be the next time frame. So with that, I will see you in the next video. Slava Ukraini, and do побачення.